The Newton Jane Doe, also known as Allison Mills, identified as Mary Angie Cowan. On May 14, 1985, a woman was found injured and unconscious off the side of the Georgia Highway 91, north of Newton, Georgia. She had injuries consistent with falling from a vehicle. She had with her a pillow that said Allison Mills on it, which is how she got her nickname. They would go ahead and take her to the hospital in Albany, but she passed away 17 days later, on June 1st, 1985. She never regained consciousness. It would be determined that the cause was blunt force trauma to the head, and they believed it was from the accident, that it may have been falling from a truck or even a car. They were able to send a sample of her bones to a private company for isotope analysis in 2012. Often the isotope analysis isn't a great way at identifying anyone, but it's the cheapest tool they have at hand, involving testing their remains. The authorities didn't give up, and 10 years later, as so many people were finally getting their names, the GBI would partner with the FBI, and they would submit to Othram Labs. Othram is at the forefront of this identification right now. Or at least it seems that way from where we stand, because a lot of the videos that I do on this channel come from identifications from Othram Labs. NamUs is the one who funded this case. They successfully extracted her DNA and began genealogical searches using the public DNA kits. And as we know, that's either GEDmatch or Family Tree, or perhaps both. It took less than a year, and they would find they likely had a name, believing she was Mary Cowan, who went by the name of Angie. They would reach one of her kids, and they tested the child's DNA, and it came back showing a parent-child relationship, which confirmed it. It would turn out that Angie, or Mary Hammett Hall Cowan as she was legally known, disappeared at the age of 28 from Florida in late May of 1985. And this, of course, is the same month that she fell from a vehicle, possibly while hitchhiking. She was found on June 1st, 1985 in Newton, Georgia. 37 years would pass before she was identified on January 31st, 2023. If anyone has any information on what happened to Angie or why, please contact the number on the screen. Angie Cowan went unidentified for 37 years. Had Angie lived, she'd be 65 years old today. The Greene County John Doe, identified as Frank Connell. Frank lived in Rensselaer, New York in 2007. The 47-year-old man decided to go out for a drink on April 20th, which was a Friday. He was last seen between the hours of 9:30 and 11:45 p.m., drinking at Gibson's Bar at 852 Broadway in Rensselaer. And afterwards, he traveled to a nearby bar named Den Den's. Frank worked at a sheetrock business that was owned by his family, and he was responsible. It was really uncharacteristic of him to miss work. But miss work he did. And he also missed a concert that he had tickets for. As a result, his family would quickly report him missing. The police would respond with 2 bloodhounds, and after smelling pants that Frank had worn, they used this scent to travel through the city to find where he went. It eventually led to a boat dock on Broadway, and they continued up to the river, leading police to believe he perhaps jumped into the Hudson River. They considered the circumstances of his disappearance to be suspicious, but no one really knew for sure what happened. Did he jump? Did someone push him? Or was this a false lead? There was a suggestion then that the 5'5", blonde-haired, blue-eyed man took his own life. His friends came forward and said they saw no indication that he had any sort of depression or was struggling in any way. There was no indication he would have taken his life, but then where was he? His apartment didn't have any signs of foul play either. There was no indication there was a struggle or anything of the sort. A psychic would come forward, a woman named Ann Fisher. She would walk that same scene in 2008, saying she did not get the feeling that someone took Frank's life. What his family did not know is that in 2017, a man was searching for arrowheads in Coxsackie, New York, and instead of finding arrowheads, he found a skull near the Hudson River. It would turn out that Frank had gone into the river just as most originally believed, though no one knows why. Frank Connell was missing for 16 years and an unidentified John Doe for 5. He was found 25 miles away from where he went missing. Had he lived, he'd be 63 years old today. The Bucks County John Doe, identified as Richard Thomas Alt. In June of 1986, a fisherman would find a skull along the banks of the Delaware River in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. Because he lived in Buckingham County, he would take the skull to the Buckingham Township Police, which was about 20 miles away from where he found it. No other remains were found, and there was little investigation that could even be done as a result. It's crazy to think how far we have come since 1986, as they had no idea what would come later. Now it's happening pretty fast, but back then they had no idea they would ever find the names of these John and Jane Does. They did the best they could, and they tried to estimate what a person looked like. Even that is better now, as they can use a computer now to approximate it, instead of the clay that they used so long ago. They would eventually do his DNA and enter him into NamUs, but they had no real leads. Then, in September of 2022, Othram Labs would get the case, and this was funded by AudioChuck. It was Othram that would, at the end, do the DNA needed for genealogy, and they would come up with a name as to who this was. The research would lead to a 49-year-old Florida woman that they suspected was related to the man. She would tell detectives she was 11 when her father went missing from Trenton. Her father's name was Richard Thomas Alt. She would explain that her dad went missing with his girlfriend. The girlfriend's remains were found, but he was not. They would manage turning her DNA around in 4 days, eager to prove that she was in fact the child of Richard Alt. And she was. Richard Thomas Alt was reported missing to the Trenton Police Department in 1985. He had actually last been seen on Christmas Eve, 1984, when he saw his parents. Early on, they would suspect that he and his girlfriend were victims whose lives were taken. 4 months after they were last seen, in April of 1985, the girlfriend was found in that same Delaware River, but there was no sign of 31-year-old Richard Alt. They had long believed he was gone forever and that he was a victim. The Bucks County DA closed their case, given it was pretty clear the crime didn't happen in Bucks County. Anyone with information now must call the Mercer County prosecutor at the number I've given on the screen. Richard Thomas Alt was missing for 38 years, and an unidentified John Doe for 36. Had he lived, he would be 69 years old today. The Elizabethtown John Doe, identified as Ricky Allen Leslie. On December 30th, 2006, a male was found alongside the road on the northbound Interstate 65 near mile marker 95, east of Elizabethtown, Kentucky. He was dressed in an insulated red flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, black belt, gray polo shirt, and State Street brand brown shoes in a size 11. There was no identification, and as best they could tell, he was probably aged 50 to 70, which is still pretty wide. He was 6 feet tall and 140 pounds. Investigators found that no information would identify the man. So who was he? Also, the weight with his height was really low, so perhaps his life was a bit of a struggle up until that point. They believed it to be natural causes. There wasn't any trauma of any kind found. They believed he'd only been there for a few weeks. In 2021, the Hardin County Coroner's Office would reach out to the DNA Doe Project, asking them to intervene and try to find his name. While it took 7 months to complete the testing and the genealogy volunteers who would sort through the results, and build his tree, eventually settled on one man, Ricky Allen Leslie. The only option found that was close enough was a large segment of the X chromosome. This would lead to Ricky Leslie's sister. His sister is still alive and would share that Ricky was 63 and he'd been living in a nursing home for undisclosed reasons. She last saw him in December of 2006 when he was released, and she dropped him off at a hotel close to I-65 in Elizabethtown. She at the time was arranging some things so that he could come live at her home. She told him she'd be back for him shortly and then he would come live with her, but he vanished. No one was quite sure what happened to him or where he went, and because of his illness, they believed it likely natural. Ricky Allen Leslie went unidentified for 16 years. He was found in the same area he went missing. Had he lived, he would be 79 today. The Fairbanks John Doe, identified as Gary Frank Sotherden. A New York Times article in 1976 would describe a 25-year-old man named Gary who traveled from Clay, New York to Alaska that same year, and he was never heard from again. So while his family knew he was missing in 1976, what they did not know is that 21 years later, on July 23, 1997, a skull was found along the Porcupine River in northeastern Alaska. And this was in a pretty remote area. This was about 8 miles from the Alaskan-Canadian border, which is close to Fairbanks. The authorities believed the cause was likely a bear attack, but there was some belief that he may have passed due to exposure, and the bear attack took place afterwards. It would take 8 months from the time that they began trying to find his name until they identified him on February 6, 2023. They would reach out to his brother, giving him the news that they'd found Gary. His brother Stephen would say he always believed his brother may have fallen through ice. He would tell the New York Times that he was sad to know what happened to his brother, that it was much more brutal than he'd imagined, saying the disappearance was hard on the family, but he's glad they know the truth now. Gary's sister Anne and her daughter would share this is what they considered the end of an age-old mystery. Their family had actually erected a gravestone for Gary a few years after he went missing. They never believed he survived. They knew he wouldn't disappear on purpose, saying, still, it's a welcome closure, and would describe Gary as a hippie kind of person, saying he was open and so accepting of people. He also played the trumpet, he enjoyed lifting weights, and he had many hobbies. He was a kind soul who was accepting of everybody around him. He had a huge fascination with winters in Canada. He'd spent a few of them there. He spoke to people who'd worked on the Alaska pipeline, and he developed a huge fascination with the idea of trapping in the rugged Alaskan wilderness. It seemed like the perfect challenge for Gary, and he was up for it. He traveled with a friend of his named Stan. The two men planned all along to go it alone. They planned to split up and then meet back with each other in the spring and catch a plane out. Stan didn't make it that long, though. He had medical problems, and in November or December of 1976, he decided he had to leave. He would try to find Gary before he left, but it didn't work. No one was particularly worried yet, though, as Gary planned to wait much longer anyway. He had no plans to leave, so him not reappearing wasn't a concern. But then Gary didn't show up that following spring. His family would file a missing person report, and they even paid a mountain guide to go searching for him that summer. The guide did find Gary's campsite. Gary's wallet and glasses were inside, but there was no sign of Gary. His family took it as a sign that something had happened, and then they chose to honor Gary by erecting the headstone in Pine Plains Cemetery in Clay, New York. The headstone reads, "Lost in Alaska." There was some anger and denial originally, but they finally came to a point where they accepted he wasn't coming back. Their family was long angry at what they considered the lack of assistance by investigators. Not only did they seem disinterested in looking for him, They seemed to have no real desire to even respond to the family in their quest to find Gary. The family would learn now that there had been some leads in the case, but the authorities didn't share them with the family. It's especially unfortunate as he went missing in the same general area. It doesn't appear that they had tried to match dental records with Gary. They could have had the answer so much sooner had they done this. Anne would explain that she believes Gary spent his final days doing what he loved, in the place that he loved the most. She would say he chose his life knowing what he was doing was dangerous, but he was willing to take that chance. It was just a part of who Gary was. Gary went missing 45 years ago. He went unidentified for 25. He went missing 4,000 miles away from home in New York. Had Gary survived, he would be around 71 years old today. The Columbus, Georgia John Doe, identified as Matthew Turner. In February of 2021, a man was located in a wooded area behind Dunkin' Donuts in Columbus, Georgia. The GBI, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, would create a forensic sketch, and they would release it in hopes of determining who the man was, or at least that it might provide some leads. They were able to tell he was around 5'10" and 150 pounds. They were unable to determine anything more, and even what caused his passing was a mystery. In January of 2023, the Muskogee County Coroner's Office released the information that said that 41-year-old Matthew Turner, who was reported missing in January of 2019, had been found. He was last seen in uptown Columbus near Front Avenue exactly 4 years earlier, in January of 2019. I wish I could tell you more about him, but this is all I've found so far. Matthew Turner was reported missing from the same area where he was found. He was a missing person for 4 years and an unidentified John Doe for 2. Had he lived, he'd be 44 years old today. The Vancouver John Doe, identified as Michael Johnson. A man was found in the Columbia River in Vancouver, Washington in 1989. He was wearing a blue windbreaker, a striped shirt, and a maroon t-shirt. He had on Rustler jeans and Rockport brand shoes. He was the victim of a GS wound, but who he was a big mystery. Just as big of a mystery as who did this to him. They tried as hard as they could to find his name, but there were no leads. He was identified in January of 2023. It turns out he was originally from California, and he'd had no contact with his family for about 20 years, so they don't even know what happened. His DNA was submitted to a laboratory in Virginia, and it eventually led to the son of Chesley Johnson Jr. They had a son named Michael Johnson, whose work history abruptly ended in 1998. In October of 2022, the authorities approached the other children of that couple, who had confirmed they hadn't seen their brother in a very long time. It turns out that Michael disappeared from his family in 1978, though it's not clear why. While he was 53 when he passed, no one in his family knows what he was doing or what might have happened to him since he was 33. This is why it is so important that anyone who knew him come forward. Even if you have the tiniest bit of information, it may help. Michael Johnson went unidentified for 24 years. Had he lived, he would be 77 today. The Grants Pass Jane Doe, 1986. Identified as Elsie Baker. Elsie Baker was 63 and living in Oregon in June of 1959. She used a wheelchair to get around her home in Josephine County, which is in the Rogue River area of Oregon. Not only did Elsie need the wheelchair to get around, the wheelchair was found still in her home when she went missing. Yet she was nowhere to be found and she could not have walked away. In addition to Elsie being missing, it was known that she had $10,000 in cash in the house, and that too was gone. Additionally, this would mean, of course, that her friends and family all knew it was there. So it apparently wasn't a secret. And in 1959, $10,000 in cash was a lot. It's equal to the buying power of $102,807 today. It was a huge amount of money. Her friends missed her and they called the police. They were originally concerned that because of her health, something had happened and she was in crisis. She lived alone, as she and her husband Frank had moved to Idaho from Oregon, but Frank filed for divorce from Elsie in May of 1955, and Frank himself passed in November of 1958. So this left Elsie living alone, though she had a nurse who helped her out with some of her health needs. When the police arrived at her home, they found everything in order. The only thing missing was Elsie. There was no sign of a struggle at all, and there were a lot of reasons for her friends to worry, as Elsie was fighting cancer and struggling with other health problems. So life wasn't very easy for Elsie. No one believed that Elsie left on her own, which is, of course, supported by the fact the wheelchair was there. The police would interview her nurse shortly thereafter, and it was the nurse who told the police that Elsie decided to go live with family out of state. This led the police to believe she'd left on her own accord and was still alive. But then her niece came forward. Her niece would learn many months later that her aunt had planned to visit her. Her Aunt Elsie had told her mom, Elsie's sister, that she planned on visiting. And when the niece visited her mother and found out this was a plan, she would realize that no one had heard or seen Aunt Elsie since. This made her suspicious, and she showed up in Idaho in the summer of 1959. She was unable to find any hint of what happened to Elsie. She traveled around Rogue River looking, but to no avail. That niece would then report Elsie missing, placing the report with the Medford office of the Oregon State Police on September 1st, 1960. It's unclear where her daughter and grandchildren were living at the time, but definitely not there. It's known that she had one child, who gave birth to 9 children of her own. Elsie was also from a large family, so there were a lot of relatives, but none living nearby. The circle of who knew about the money could be pretty large between friends, family, and the nurse. Just by the way this plays out, it seems she probably wasn't close to any of her family members at the time, as no one else reported her missing. A newspaper article published in 1960 would outline how suspicious her disappearance was. The police would agree, and they would eventually conclude that she was no longer alive, and that none of the circumstances made any sense. The police would interview family, friends, and no one had talked to her. Additionally, her illness was pretty advanced at the time, so she likely didn't have much life left, especially since she stopped getting medical care. Her family and friends did what they could to keep the word out there. From that article, it would say, Mrs. Elsie Marie Campbell, a slight little woman with tinted red hair, was last seen around her home at 4890 South Pacific Highway, Grants Pass, Oregon, between June 6th and June 13th, 1959. The state police know that she couldn't have left unassisted. It was disclosed they had sold her home and her car the year before. This is how she'd raised the cash. When she sold the home, she withdrew all of the money and kept it at her house. Her friends and family did what they could to push the case into the news. There were multiple articles written, including a front-page story in Coos Bay. I'm sure, like me, that your first thought was the nurse, since the nurse appears to have lied about where she went. But I can't find any reference to exactly what the nurse said, or what happened to her, or if she was even questioned. The nurse is obviously an issue, but it's possible a friend or family member told the nurse Elsie left to stay with family. Keeping cash like this wasn't entirely unusual either for that time. I know my grandparents were only about 15 years younger than Elsie, and they too kept these kinds of amounts in a safe on their property. And the reason for this is that there was a great concern for those that lived through the Great Depression that something might happen to their cash. Even my own grandmother would sometimes hoard food. They were always worried about what would happen, so it wouldn't be unusual. but unfortunately keeping that money there may have been what caused this. The answer wouldn't come until February of 2023. It would turn out that on June 19, 1986, a man had decided to excavate a portion of his property and put in a septic system. And this was at a rural home in Grants Pass, Oregon, which was about 30 miles away from Elsie's home. When he'd bought the home, which was about 12 years prior, he had noticed that there was a depression in the ground. He and a friend and his 9-year-old daughter were digging in that area in order to place the septic system. And now we know why it was depressed. He got about 4 feet down and he discovered the skeletal remains of a woman. The daughter remembers her dad picking up the skull, and he thought his friend was playing a joke on him. It wasn't until the owner called the police that the friend believed it wasn't a joke. Upon examination, they would determine she was around 5'2" or 5'3" and elderly. There was wear on her dentures, and she had a degenerative joint disease. They believed she'd been there about 15 to 25 years. The detectives worked the case off and on for years, but there were no leads. It appears they either didn't or couldn't match with any missing person reports from the area. Although, of course, we know that Elsie was reported missing. That said, it's important to point out it seems like a lot of the paperwork went missing throughout this time. And of course, there were no computers that would keep the data forever. Her remains were eventually sent back and forth between multiple organizations. They would eventually land in storage with the Oregon State Medical Examiner. It's unclear why they didn't realize it was Elsie, given she went missing from that area, but it's also important to note that 27 years separated the time she went missing to the time they had those bones at the medical examiner's office. In 2016, a bone sample was sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. But unlike so many does before her, the sample was too degraded with bacteria to process and upload into CODIS. Despite the advances in technology, they just couldn't do it. They would try again 2 years later in 2018, and they got a little bit better result, but only a partial DNA profile was able to be drawn up. They would need to use a grant and submit it to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon began with phenotyping, so they knew she had brown hair and hazel eyes. And she was of northern to southeastern European descent. They were also able to determine they would likely be a good candidate for advanced genetic genealogy. Things were finally beginning to happen. By June of 2022, they had numerous leads to follow in the case, leading to genetically close relatives that would lead to a family of 9 children raised in Nez Perce, Idaho. They were pretty sure that their Jane Doe was one of those kids. The 6 girls in the family were Ethel, Clara, Edith, and Lydia, all of whom had documented lives and deaths, except for Clara. They were lucky because there was actually a lot of genealogy research publicly available done by multiple family members, and it would lead to Clara's treatment records, showing that she was last seen by a doctor at Josephine General Hospital in Grants Pass, Oregon, in June of 1959. This would, if correct, mean she disappeared around June of 1959. Thankfully, one of Elsie's grandsons had a full family tree online. They would do the DNA. We now know it was, in fact, Elsie Marie Baker, who had been buried in that area. And the way they do that is by how many centimorgans of identical autosomal DNA match. In this case, it was 1,621 centimorgans. There was also 178 centimorgans on the X chromosome. If anyone is unaware of how these percentages work, I thought maybe it might be interesting to demonstrate from my own results. I included info on the centimorgans from GEDmatch, along with my 23andMe results, so you can see how many there are in my relations. Because my mother and daughter are also in GEDmatch, that's why those are the ones showing here. You can see the total centimorgans for my mom is 3,568. For my daughter, it's 3,561. For Elsie, the match was 1,621 and 178. By comparison, for me, the closest match, other than my mom and my daughter, is 30 centimorgans. And in this case, it's my mother's cousin or second cousin. Something like that. I don't even know who the person is. It starts to drop off pretty quickly as you move away from the close matches. This is why they often get stuck trying to work things backwards, if the matches have less DNA in common. So in this case, they were lucky it was her grandson showing online. Additionally, the X chromosome is about 3 times larger than the Y chromosome. The X chromosome contains about 900 genes, while the Y chromosome only has 55. So this all comes into play. You'll often see them revert to trying to trace the X chromosome. The Josephine County Sheriff would provide a statement that explained there is no state funding offered for use at a private facility, which is an interesting fact I've not seen addressed before, and I've covered over 100 of these cases. They would explain that the cost for doing analysis at Parabon is really high. It turns out it's around $6,000 to $9,000 just for the procedure itself. It's the first time I've seen that laid out, actually. I always thought that the cost addressed included exhumation, but it doesn't. Or at least it doesn't in this case. It also explains why it's so slow in processing older identifications. Obviously, it's very involved if it costs that much and takes months to do. The sheriff in this case obtained a grant from the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office. When authorities came to the scene almost 30 years ago, after the 1959 search for Elsie. When Elsie was found, they found some fabric that was believed to be from a dress, a set of dentures, and 2 rubber stopper-type implements that were later determined to be from a walker or crutches. This case would cause the medical examiner's office to take an inventory of all still unidentified human skeletal remains, and they counted more than 120, not all of which they knew were there. That's what's really disturbing about these cases, too. They keep finding them in places like universities and offices. And of course, many were buried, sometimes in graves that weren't marked. To their credit here, once they discovered the 120 remains, they worked tirelessly to get them entered into NamUs to try to find names for these missing people. This was when the medical examiner's office applied for and would receive a $405,000 grant from the National Institute of Justice. The grant was awarded in 2018, but the analysis didn't begin until 2020. The pandemic slowed some of the lab work, but the grant was extended for a period of time so that they could do what they could. As a result, they were able to generate leads on 42 cases, 30 of which have now been solved. This includes both crimes and unidentified does. For me, and I imagine all of you, it's just half of the issue. Who did this to her and those like her is a huge issue, and it's likely one that's not going to be resolved. The police are clear that in this case there isn't perpetrator DNA to run, that even her own DNA was almost impossible. And then, of course, there is how old this case is. So whoever did this is most likely no longer alive. But of course, that doesn't mean her family doesn't deserve an answer. If anyone knows anything about this case, maybe a relative mentioning something about it out of guilt, please come forward. Her family deserves some kind of answers. Elsie Baker was born 126 years ago, in 1896. She was a missing person for nearly 64 years, and an unidentified Jane Doe for 36. She was found 30 miles away from where she went missing. Before I dig into the next case, I want to ask people to respond with what they think. At first, I wasn't going to say anything about this, and I did leave a message on the video in question. But I think it's really important for people to be honest and tell me what they think. I try to present things in a way that the family isn't hurt. And that's really important to me more than anything else. That's why I don't blame the victims for any choices made. And sometimes I make excuses if I think people in the comments are going to say something negative. I don't want their family members to see it. And I have had family members comment on my videos, and they've said something very nice and thanking me for covering the case. So, not to suggest that I've had a lot of negative feedback, but I sometimes get nasty comments about what I'm going to bring up right now. And then, of course, there was the emails that I got that were really horrible. I've tried really hard to try to make sure I have the facts correct, although, of course, I make mistakes just like anyone else. And I don't even cover a lot of closed cases because if the case has been closed for any amount of time, I don't want to dredge it up for families. I'm honestly trying really hard to be conscientious of the fact that what I say here can affect other people. But the email that I got, well, actually, there were 2 emails that were super disturbing from someone who says they are a family member of a doe, although the name doesn't match anyone I covered that I can even find, much less in the video that he was demanding I remove. He seems to indicate that I covered his daughter, and in addition to calling me all kinds of super offensive names, I can't even repeat what he said, but he questioned my mental abilities and made some wishes that I go missing like the people that I cover. He also threatened my life at the end of the second one. But all of this aside, which I probably shouldn't have even mentioned, it's just really disturbing. So as rattled as I was, it brings up a point that is actually really important. Because if he was this upset, maybe I've upset others and they just didn't email me, and I just get the thanks from the other side of it. What he accused me of is monetizing people's lives, spreading lies, and blaming families for the demise of their loved ones. I don't think that I've done this, but I mean, it matters if I have. Just because the way he put it is wrong doesn't mean the content of what he said is incorrect. And I would rather walk away from this than hurt anyone. Additionally, his accusation that I have monetized people to get rich is I actually make about 52 cents an hour for the work on this channel. I'm not getting rich. And that's not why I'm doing it. Generally, in feedback, you say you can hear my compassion, and that brings up the point about whether or not covering the doe cases are a problem at all. I always thought that I was celebrating their identification. I've changed this channel a lot in the 2 years it existed based on constructive criticism. I've always considered this a tribute and a celebration, and that's why I'm willing to work on it 7 days a week. I spend more time than a full-time job for making very, very little. And I'm always very clear that I don't blame them because we all get a do-over when our life goes on. We can change things around, and they didn't get a chance to do that. But the thing that seemed to cause the most anger for him is that I act as if newspaper coverage of these cases are fact. And I'm not sure what to do with that. I mean, I do get that it's not always a fact what's written in the press. My ex's brother was actually murdered in town here, and I know very little of what was in the paper was accurate. It was close, but it wasn't right. And so I'm sure he's right that a lot of the newspaper coverage is off some, but I don't control what was written in the newspapers. And this is the information that I have out there. I've tried reaching out to family members before, and they usually don't even reply, so I've stopped doing that. So what I have is what was written in the press. But I don't want to torment and hurt people as I'm accused of doing either. The way he said it was really nasty, but that doesn't always mean what he's saying is wrong. I'm not trying to put this guy on blast either. I'm not going to identify him or say any more about what he said. That's not what this is about. Now, if I say something that isn't true and a family member sees it, they are always welcome to tell me, and I will let them comment and pin it at the top. I try to be fair. So if there's any different way to handle these or not handling it at all, if you guys could let me know what you think, I would honestly really appreciate it. This sort of rattled me to my core, and it sort of redid how I think about the cases that I'm covering. So with that, let's dig into the next case. The Mojave Jane Doe, identified as Marina Ramos. This story begins on December 12, 1989, and it takes place on Old Temple Bar Road in Mojave County, Arizona. This is located around 50 miles south of Las Vegas. The site itself has a sad history, as other people have been found abandoned in that same area. In this case, the woman was found wearing no clothing. It was the result of someone using a knife that had led to her demise. She was in an area known as a dumping ground, and other victims have been found there. DNA would lead to more questions than answers, and the Sheriff's Office Special Investigations Unit would begin working on this case in February of 2022. And it was this investigation that would lead to her name 1 year later, in February of 2023. Marina Ramos was 28 when she disappeared from Bakersfield, California, which is about 350 miles away from where she was found. Maria wasn't the only one missing. When she disappeared, so did her 2 daughters, Elizabeth Lisa Ramos, who was 14 months, and Jasmine Maria Ramos, who was only 2 months old. Hopefully these kids are alive and okay, but there's no indication of what even happened to them. This actually reminds me, though, of the case of Harold and Tina Klaus, and they had moved with their daughter Holly, if anyone's not familiar, and their remains were found without a child. There are many reasons for taking kids that come to mind, and none of them are good. But in the case of Holly, she was adopted and had a good life. So Elizabeth and Jasmine, there's a chance they're okay, that they even had a decent life. It's also the hope that her family is holding on to. So I implore anyone who has any idea about this at all to please call the number given at the end of this video. Marina was identified thanks to fingerprints that the FBI were able to use, along with a new program that reads hard-to-read prints. This has actually given a number of people back their names. In this case, it led to a cousin who identified Marina and shared that the girls were also missing. The cousin gave her DNA, and it matched. So it was confirmed that this was, in fact, Marina Ramos. But where are the kids? They would be in their early 30s now. A sketch was released with the help of one of Marina's relatives, a woman who had cared for the girls for a while. She had cared for them when Marina was held on a shoplifting charge, which, thanks to this charge, was actually how she was identified. So it was a good thing. That relative described a man named Fernando, who had been hanging around Marina. He was between 30 and 40 at the time. The last time her family saw her, she was in Bakersfield with Fernando, and that man, they did say, was Hispanic. They got into Fernando's black SUV to go to Ontario, California, where he reportedly lived. This was about 150 miles south of Bakersfield in 1989. If this rings a bell with anyone, please call the number on the screen. Marina Ramos went unidentified for 33 years. She was found 150 miles away from home. Had she survived, she would be 61 today. I've included the number for a secret witness as well as an email. You can send anonymous tips. If you have any idea what happened to Marina Ramos or those girls, or even the identity of Fernando, please call the number. Fernando would likely be in his early 60s to early 70s. The Independence Pass John Doe, 1970, identified as Gardner Paul Smith. 2 men were hiking on July 15, 1970, several miles east of Independence Pass Summit in Colorado. They would discover our John Doe in a ditch alongside the road. He was covered by rockfall. They believe he was 5'6" to 5'7", and around 125 to 150 pounds. He had on 3 pairs of socks and tennis or hiking shoes, with an unworn sock over his left shoe, which is a little odd. He was carrying $7 and a razor. There was no identification with him. There was some damage to his remains that they felt had been done by a snowplow after the fact. There were plans to have the FBI fingerprint him, but if they did, it wasn't noted. The Herald-Democrat would publish a story on June 22, 1970. They would list his age as being in his 20s and around 5'7" to 5'8". While they believed his age to be in the 20s, they were wrong by a couple of decades. One of the shocking facts of this story is that Colorado had forgotten him. A man named John Pearson, who was a Vietnam vet, it was him who took it upon himself, and this led to a grave belonging to an unnamed man. John Pearson took it upon himself to discover who the man was, and thanks to him, it happened. Unfortunately, John passed away in March of 2021 without knowing that it was his motions that would lead the man to a name. John had contacted an analyst with the CBI, which is the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. That analyst met with him in August of 2011 and even went to the grave. That's the worst part of these cases. So many are completely lost. Thanks to Pearson, however, this John Doe was back on the radar of Colorado law enforcement. They actually looked for records in this case, and they intended to work it again, but there were 0 records. Whatever records belonged to this were gone. They did, however, manage to find a mention in a local paper at one point. So clearly the authorities knew about it. 2 years later, in April of 2013, investigators returned and tried again. Still, no records were found. They exhumed the man and managed to get a fingerprint, but then the fingerprint led nowhere. DNA was extracted and sent to the University of Northern Texas. They had intended to rebury the man, but for some reason, it didn't happen. Instead, his remains stayed at the Bailey Kent home. Then they were again found when the funeral home was raided by the sheriff's office in 2021. It was after this that he was reburied. I had some interesting comments by a group of people in one of my John Doe videos. Without going too far into it, a group of them sort of ganged together to get mad at my suggestion that police should identify these men and women. I just thought it was an interesting choice on a John Doe video. They assert identifying people is a waste of money. Because others were fully agreeing, I kind of wondered how many believe this. It does seem that a lot of cases are forgotten and without paperwork. There's a lot of reasons paperwork could get lost. And of course, this man was found over 50 years ago in this case. But thankfully, the CBI didn't give up. It would take DNA to arrive at his name, finally identifying the man as Gardner Paul Smith. Gardner's DNA would lead to a cousin, who would then in turn call Jeannie Smith Giada, who is now a realtor in Austin, Texas. Jeannie is Gardner's daughter. What she knew of her father was that he had deserted his family shortly after her birth and had never been heard from again. It turns out that he may not have entirely walked away after all. She was later contacted by a forensic genealogist at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and they would provide her with a 2016 Herald-Democrat article describing the story of finding the Independence Pass John Doe. Jeannie would share that she spent the last 60 years angry at her father for walking away, and her mother and other family members were upset enough not to even share information about him. Gardner Smith was born September 22, 1930, and he attended school at Modesto High School in California. He would have been 40 years old had he lived to the day he'd been found. The Smith family included a younger brother named Armour, and all of them were a skiing family. It was a family-wide passion, and his father Paul's obituary in the Modesto Bee lists him as having created a ski resort in California. His father, Paul, discovered skiing in 1936 on a trip to the Midwest. In fact, Paul's wife too was a skier, so it makes sense the boys would be too. Paul Smith lived to be 93 and his wife 88, never knowing what happened to Gardner. It appears they believed him to be alive, as he's listed as a survivor in their obituaries. It seems his whole family believed he walked away, which is sad on a very different level for everyone involved. For Gardner, skiing was everything. He would even ski while he was in college on a team for the University of Nevada, located in Reno. Jeannie had held on to one clipping of her dad, and that was for a win he had on a team when he took first in events for jumping, cross country, and downhill skiing. After college, Gardner joined the Army. He would serve for 2 years in active duty, eventually ending up in the reserves for the next 4. He was honorably discharged in June of 1957. By 1960, he would be a writer. He eventually ended up being a freelance writer who would write in Aspen about those who were believed to be contenders for the Olympics. His writing would eventually lead him to Argentina, and it was there that he met and fell in love with a woman named Jennifer, who was actually from England. The couple would travel back to the U.S., where they would marry, and she would eventually give birth to one child in 1962. This was the daughter, Jeannie, who was recently contacted by the genealogist. The marriage didn't last, however, and they would divorce in 1968. At this time, Jeannie was 6. Her mother would quickly remarry, but that man would pass in 1974. Jeannie would explain that she struggled, as her mother was not a nurturing person. As a result, she would end up traveling from the Bay Area to Modesto, where Gardner's parents lived. She eventually found herself living with them permanently. She had many questions about her father, but there were none that anyone was willing to answer. She pushed her mom for information, but her mom refused to talk. An article would appear in 1983 in an issue of Ski magazine, and this article was dedicated to Gardner Smith and his disappearance, titled The Mystery of Gardner Smith. The article was written by Dick Dorworth, who was himself a skier and a coach. It turns out that Dick respected and was friends with Gardner. Gardner was a decade older, and Dick looked up to him. Dick would recall a story in the magazine about how he and Gardner had flown to Guatemala during the 1954 revolution, and they would find themselves in jail together. He would relate that Gardner would often say, "Whatever's right, friend." Dick would state that the last time he saw Gardner was in 1968. Gardner was living on the road at the time and trying to market a ski pole grip that he had designed. He had also designed a double lens goggle, but neither invention took off. By 1968, Gardner was 38 and he wasn't doing well physically. The activities in his youth had taken a toll on his body. He would end up staying on Dick's couch for a week, and Dick would describe him as having a sharp mind, despite his physical troubles. Jeannie was aware of this article that had happened, and in her quest of trying to learn about her father, she would actually find herself traveling to see him in Idaho in order to ask Dick some questions about her dad. This would have been around 2006 or 2008. And despite the pain of feeling abandoned by her father, part of her wanted to know who he was and what he was about. The gap in time between when he last saw his family and whatever happened to him means it's open-ended as to whether the result was an accident or foul play, as no one really knows exactly what was going on with her father at the time. Jeannie believes her father was homeless at the end of his life and that he might have been experiencing some mental health issues. Gardner was very familiar with Colorado, and this was because of his love of skiing. He was especially familiar with Aspen, and he was found about 3 hours away from there, in Twin Lakes. It appears the conclusion of this case is that it was likely an accident, but his daughter isn't so sure. She feels he may have been a victim and was placed where he was found. The sock over the one shoe is puzzling. There's no mention of if there was a hole in the shoe or some other reason that might have led to this, but I imagine that would have been addressed were it so. While this answers the question ultimately of what happened to him, there's that gap between when he was found and when he walked away from his family, and unfortunately, no one knows why he left, or even why he was in Colorado. There seems to be an implication that his health wasn't that he could go skiing. Gardner's wife, Jennifer Dillard, died on July 5th, 1994, and like his parents, she never knew what happened to him. Gardner's daughter would email her father's friend, Dick Dorworth, who wrote that article so long ago, to tell him of her father's identification before it hit the news. Gardner Paul Smith went unidentified for 52 years. Had he lived, he'd be 91 today. The Carson City John Doe 2020, identified as Ronald Vincent Hendricks. On September 20th, 2020, several bicyclists were riding on the Flume Trail at Marriott Lake in Carson City, Nevada. They would discover a human skull next to the trail. They would report this to the sheriff, who would then in turn contact a rescue team and who came to the scene. They would search and eventually acquire a canine to also search with them. As a result, they would discover more remains on the steep mountainside. The Carson City Sheriff's Office would partner with Intermountain Forensics, which is located in Salt Lake City. They developed a DNA profile that was appropriate for GEDmatch and family tree use. This then narrowed everything down, leading to the siblings of Ronald Hendricks. They would obtain DNA from those siblings, which would confirm on February 17, 2023, that the remains found did in fact belong to Ronald. His siblings would explain that Ronald's vehicle was found in the Spooner Lake parking lot in 1992. He was last seen snowshoeing his way toward the lake. Searches took place in hopes of finding him at the time in December of 1992. They weren't able to find him, so they again searched in July of 1993. But again, they found nothing. It would be noted that his remains were found 5 miles away from where he was last seen in 1992, so they weren't searching in the right spot. It was said that he had been expressing feelings of depression at the time and had considered taking his own life. His family has long believed this is what happened. Ronald Hendricks disappeared 30 years ago. He was an unidentified John Doe for 2 years. He was found 5 miles away from where he went missing. Had he lived, he would be 69 today. The Carson City Jane Doe 2015, identified as Joyce Rodgers Annis. Around 11 a.m. on March 17, 2015, a person was walking by when they saw a tennis shoe sticking out of the ground near a walking trail just north of the Lone Mountain Cemetery in Carson City, Nevada. The responding investigator would discover there were human remains wrapped in a sleeping bag buried in a shallow grave below. An autopsy would determine it was a small female between the ages of 42 and 71. She was likely only 4'6" to 5'1". She was wearing a long-sleeved camel print shirt and sweatpants. She had on a size 7 athletic shoe. It was a long, sad road to her name. It took 13 volunteers, hundreds and hundreds of hours trying to connect the matches. They worked it with family trees going back to ancestors born in the 1700s in England, hoping that once they moved forward then, they would be able to locate her name. It did eventually lead to 6 female siblings, and they kept following up as they went. They got a lucky break in October of 2022. This led to close family members' ancestry DNA that had been uploaded recently to GEDmatch. The authorities would say connecting the dots between our Jane Doe and her matches was complex and time-consuming. The tree covered 9 generations, complicated with immigration, that showed the matches were not only distantly related to her, but they were distant in location also. In this case, it finally led to Joyce Rodgers, who, along with her husband, Edward Burton, were homeless and living in the area of Fallon, Nevada. Her husband, Edward, would indicate that Joyce passed from an illness and he had buried her in the area as a matter of respect. The case has been submitted to the Carson City DA for possible charges. Joyce Rodgers Annis went unidentified for 7 years. The Longview John Doe, identified as Jade David Feigert. In February of 2020, a longshoreman would arrive at a dock in Longview, Washington. He would notice something wasn't right in the blackberry bushes near the dock. He would investigate and then call the sheriff. They would arrive and discover skeletal remains buried in blackberry bushes. The man would be sent to the King County Medical Examiner, where they would note that there was no signs of trauma and the COD was unknown. If anyone is concerned as to what my abbreviations mean here, for obvious reasons I can't always say everything on YouTube, So I've started a list of abbreviations that will be in the description of all newer videos. Although they couldn't determine the why, they would hopefully determine who. They would employ a forensic odontologist, but they were not able to match dental x-rays with any missing person in the National Missing Person Database. They would end up using forensic-grade genome sequencing and genetic genealogy, where they were able to identify potential family members thanks to Othram Labs. Law enforcement and detectives would then contact the family, learning that they had a missing family member named Jade David Feigert. He was 22 and had been living in Columbia County, Oregon when he went missing in February of 2017. He was last seen when he was dropped off in Kelso, Washington by his mother. Detectives worked with his mother and sent her DNA profile, sending this off to Othram. Othram would then compare the DNA and determine it was a match to a mother-son relationship. Detectives also contacted his father, Michael Smith, who lives in Texas. It's unknown exactly what happened to him. Jade was missing for 6 years, almost to the day, and was a John Doe for 3. Had Jade lived, he would be 28 today. He was found 20 miles away from where he went missing. The Sherman County John Doe, identified as David West Jr. In early 1989, some people were on the John Day River in Morrow, Oregon, which is just a small town of less than 400 people, and they were planning to go rafting that day. And instead they found themselves discovering remains along the bank of the river before they had even set out on the water. The police would arrive and search for more, finding nothing and coming back again that same month, as well as March and again in April, trying to find more remains, but there wasn't any. They estimated he was 40 to 50 and around 5'9", and they believed he'd been there for 3 years. Over the years, the local residents would come forward to suggest the man may have been there a lot longer than that 3-year estimate. They would suggest that perhaps David West Jr. had been found. It turns out that David had disappeared 24 years earlier around Christmas of 1964. He was trying to feed his cattle, and he had the habit of using a makeshift cable car to cross the water. They found the cable car, but not David. The authorities would attempt to match David via dental records, but it didn't work, and they were back to the drawing board. DNA would be extracted in 2010 and entered into CODIS, but there weren't any matches. It was April of 2022 when they would send some bones to Othram Labs in hopes that genetic genealogy would give the answers. They still believed it might be David, but of course that was just a guess. They did, however, have 2 of David's relatives come forward and provide their own DNA, and in February of 2023, it was confirmed that that DNA had matched. David West Jr. once again had a name. It's actually pretty incredible when you think about how he was found. It means other people are hopefully also recoverable, because there was a long time between he went missing and when he was found. I know I always think about how many people are out there. And I always hope that everybody looks when they're out and about. You never know what you're going to find. Human nature wants you to dismiss it as an animal. Always please consider it might be a missing person. You might have solved somebody's mystery. There are so many people missing out there. David West Jr. was missing for 58 years. He went unidentified for 33. Had he lived, he would be 80 years old today. He was found around 60 miles away by water from where he went missing. Miss X, identified as Patrona Patmios. This channel covered the case of Miss X 7 months ago, so it's really exciting to see that she was one of the cases that were recently solved, with her name coming out in February of 2023. Miss X was found in Bear, Delaware, in a rural area outside of town. They knew she was very petite, and she had a distinctive body, as her bra size was estimated to be 34 double D. This was pretty unusual for her height, as she was not very tall. Her teeth were in good condition, and she's not believed to have been homeless. She was transported to the location she was found in from elsewhere, and someone had covered her with a bag. The police would eventually succeed in tracing that bag, and it eventually led detectives to a laundromat that's located in Trenton. Unfortunately, although it's not clear how much time passed, by the time they were able to track down the laundromat, the man who owned the business at the time had passed away. However, relatives had worked there before and had taken over the business. It was they who believed they had seen her visit the laundromat, but they didn't know her name. She was eventually buried in Potter's Field in Delaware. Her COD was sepsis, and the reason for this is believed to be a word I can't say on YouTube. Let's just say that she was pregnant and didn't want to be. And she did something that was illegal in 1967, and this procedure led to an infection. Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, so this had happened 6 years prior to that happening. And she, like so many before her, would succumb to infections after receiving this illegal procedure. The result of these back alley procedures led to a lot of deaths at the time. It looks like she was about 12 weeks along when the procedure took place. Her passing was considered foul play, and I imagine the suspect is the person who did the procedure. It made me wonder how fast sepsis occurs, and please take this with a grain of salt. It appears that sepsis can occur within 12 hours, although often it's 24 to 48. They noted that a soap-like substance was found within the expected cavity. The procedure had happened not long before. A little more investigation led to me learning that soap was actually used in these procedures, which I hadn't actually heard of. It was dangerous, and it could even lead to an air embolism, as well as causing a fatty liver in those who survived. I think the reason I dug into this and what is bothering me the most is that she was not wearing clothing when she was found. Someone took her and dumped her without the dignity of clothing or a name. I'd originally believed that they left her in her underwear and covered her with the sack, but no, her legs were actually inside of the sack. They likely used it to transport her there. This one bothers me on multiple levels. It's not just the desperation that she was probably feeling, or the fact that I suspect some people will believe that she deserved what happened to her, which, for the record, I do not. But it's the idea that someone's first inclination was to wipe her identity away and dump her off without clothing as if she was garbage. She had to be so desperate, and she probably did what may have felt like the only option. So even if the person who did this didn't know her name, which I doubt, they would let years pass on and on without offering any information of what they knew, even as a random tip. Her case was re-examined in 2011 when a vial of her blood and a hair ribbon were found in an evidence container. It turned out to be a huge stroke of luck, because in 1967, there was no such thing as DNA processing, and saving the blood was unusual for the time. So it was a huge, huge stroke of luck that this was even found. They most likely never could have gotten useful DNA from her bones at the time. And then, of course, most people were embalmed, and that too makes it even harder to get DNA that is even usable. But despite what seemed like a stroke of luck, she was entered into CODIS and there were no matches. It would take uploading to a genealogy database that would eventually lead her to family in Virginia and North Carolina. But they were really distant matches, and nobody knew who she was. As a result, her case was put on hold. And this actually happens a lot in a lot of these cases. We have a lot pending right now that are on hold until there are more uploads into Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. So if you could keep that in mind and consider possibly uploading your DNA kits into those places and giving permission for it to be searched. If you don't know how, there's a link in the description below all of these videos. Thankfully, they didn't give up. Her half-brother, who lives in Greece, not in America, would decide to upload his DNA with the hopes of finding his sister. It's a little muddled, but it appears he saw the related result rather than a genealogist seeing it, and it was he who would reach out to Delaware authorities with the help of a relative who speaks English. I'm sure he hoped for a more positive result, expecting to find his half-sister alive, but it did lead to her having a name once again. Patrona went by the name of Patra. In 2020, one of her relatives had in fact posted on Facebook looking for her. So many of these relatives usually think the person walked away. So it's shocking when they find out that they didn't, that they've been in a sort of limbo all that time. Patra was born in Greece and she had immigrated to the United States in 1955. This explains why many of the matches were not in the U.S. When she was around 9 years old, she came over with 2 other family members. And that can be seen here. The distance of many of her family members added to the difficulty in finding her, and she'd been living in the U.S. about a decade when she found herself pregnant and desperate. In 1967, she would have been around 20 or 21 when she made a choice that would eventually lead to what happened to her. Anyone with further information is asked to call the number on the screen. Patra went unidentified for 55 years. Had she lived, she'd be 75 today. As always, thank you so much for watching. The current goal for the channel is 20,000 subscribers. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Thank you so much to everybody commenting. Even with just an emoji, it really has made a big difference. Without it, there isn't a channel, so thank you guys so much. Take care of yourselves and each other.